Hello, everybody. It's been a while since I've recorded one of these. It's David, and I'm back again with another episode of the Opposite of Cheating video podcast blog thing. I'm here with Professor Jason Lodge, all the way from the University of Queensland in Australia. It's an incredible honor to have you here, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
Uh, Professor Lodge is Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of Queensland and is the lead author of the Australian Framework for Artificial Intelligence in Higher Education. So don't be surprised if I don't ask him how he's heard about this academic integrity thing. Um, I do want to start off by just having you tell us a little bit about how you've gotten to be in this really interesting situation vis-a-vis psychology and AI.
Thanks, David. So I was messing around with AI way back in the 90s, and why we were playing with it in those days was to try and understand basically how the brain worked. So that's where my initial exposure to thinking about technology, and particularly AI, was. I don't have a strong technical background. I couldn't code my way out of a wet paper bag, but I was really interested in this idea of humans and machines and what the interactions look like and what we can learn about humans from what we understand about how, AI systems work and all of the processes that go into these systems and what they might tell us about how our brain works, because there's so much that we still don't understand about that. And over time, I think I just got more interested in the education side of all this. So I'm a psychological scientist. That was my PhD. And I was looking at the time at very kind of low level mechanistic learning processes. And I kept wondering, well, what does this mean for how we learn in education environments, how we learn formally and informally? And over time, those questions kind of grew. So, been playing around with the technology, was thinking a lot about learning, and then started to move into the education space. And that then brought me to thinking about all of these things holistically. What do we understand about the mechanisms of learning? How do they play out in these complex social environments that we have? And what role does technology play in that? Really, it was putting all of those pieces together, and it took a long time to think about the interaction between each of them. But that has kind of been the focus of the work that I've been doing over a couple of decades now, trying to connect all the dots across those different elements.
I resonate with that. My background is similar but different. When we were talking before, you said you started out in taste and chemical senses. How did that shift come about away from that?
My initial interest in taste is because I'm a qualified chef, so I did that for quite a long time while I was studying. So I had a kind of innate interest in thinking about taste and smell, because the two of them obviously work together really well. But I sort of realized that that kind of work was not the thing that I was most interested in. The more I looked at the learning side of this, because a lot of the things that we gravitate towards in terms of what we eat and the smells that we like, a lot of that's learned, some of it's innate. Um, but I really like the learning bit in all of that, and less so the kind of chemical senses part of it. It's hard work, that stuff. And although I find it really interesting, I did tend to want to gravitate more towards the educational environment. As a chef, you do a lot of work teaching apprentices. I worked in finance for a while, where a big part of my job was training people. So I'd kind of had this background interest and a lot of work in various education and training environments that drove what the bit of the puzzle that I was most interested in was that part, rather than the kind of taste and smell itself.
Yeah, I get that as well. So, talking about the shift into the learning sciences part of it, what would you say is? I mean, I think we all have sort of our favorite finding, whether it's ours or someone else's. What's the one thing you'd like people to know about from the learning sciences part of your career that we would want to bring to the crowd that we talk to?
I think the big lesson for me, and something that has come through both in my own experiences as a student and in a lot of the research that I've done over the last couple of decades, is that the learning that matters is often hard. I think a lot of what I hear tech companies and other people say is, we can use this technology to make learning easier and faster, right? But everything that I've seen about how learning works suggests that that's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be valuing the fact that it's hard. And I think that that is sometimes tricky for those of us who work in education, because we're kind of like the marathon runners. We've done it over and over. We kind of know it. Many of us really enjoy it. We're the type of people who, like marathon runners, will go out on the weekend and run 30 kilometers because that's what we like to do. Not all of our students are like that. And I think that we've got some work to do to try and help everybody understand the value of the work of learning. I think Kane Murdoch and Kath Ellis have talked about this idea of the work of learning in psychological science. We've talked about these things like desirable difficulties, and there's these sort of ideas about this kind of immersion in real effort in learning and the value of that I think sometimes gets lost. I think that problem is compounded by the fact that many of our education systems are so focused on the outcome that we don't necessarily spend enough time thinking about the process that we go through to get there. So, when we value outcomes so much, it's no wonder that people just go, you know what, I just want to get to the outcome in the fastest way possible. But actually, it's the sweat, the mental sweat that we've got to accumulate on the way that I think is probably the most critical part of it. And increasingly, all of the research that's coming out is suggesting more and more that particularly the way in which knowledge is becoming framed in the society that we have now and the way that we interact with machines, that work is becoming more and more critical. People talk about things like how critical thinking is so important to what we need to have in terms of adaptive skills for the age of AI. But that requires work. You've got to actually put the work in to become a good critical thinker,
Yes.
right?
Well, yes, yes, yes. Almost everything you said there, we've said in less eloquently and over the course of time. We talk about productive struggle, talk about Vygotsky and just working just at the level of your discomfort. All of those sorts of things are, I think, what a lot of us are coming to in from different directions. When I talk to my undergrads, I use a sports metaphor. And we say, learning is like training. If it's easy, you're not doing it right. Right? If you can go to the gym for an hour and not work up a sweat, have you really gone to the gym? No. If you're studying and you're not feeling like your brain hurts, are you really studying? Say exactly the same thing. The metaphor keeps working nicely, right? Would you start training for a football match the night before the match? No, of course not. That's ludicrous. So why would you start studying before the match? Right? And my favorite one is someone said this, and I've stolen this a million times. I don't lift weights because I want the weights higher up. It's the process of lifting the weights. And that's just in a nutshell what you just said. It's about process.
Yeah.
How are you translating this productive struggle process orientation to your teaching, to your assessment regimes?
Uh, I think there are several key pieces to this. One for me is I want, so I teach future teachers. I have two different groups. One is a very large group by our standards for postgraduate coursework, and that's about 250 students. And then the smaller group I have last year was about 25, so much, much smaller. Across both of those groups, one of the things that I think is most important to help my students to understand, both for them as learners and them as future educators, is to try and communicate the value of hard work, and that some of the signals that we might see within ourselves as learners, but also within our students as an educator, are not necessarily communicating what we might think they are. So the classic example of this, some work we did about a decade ago on confusion. I think if you ask most people in the street or you ask a lot of educators, what does confusion signal? I think it probably suggests something to them that is not necessarily aligned with what we understand about what role confusion might play in the learning process over time. So you ask a teacher, for example, what would you do if you look out into your classroom and you see a room full of kids who are kind of scratching their heads and, have got that kind of concentration face where it's clear that they're confused, right? And for a lot of educators, they'll say, "Oh, we give them the answer." It's like, "Oh, no, 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 hold on a second. If you think about what role this experience of hitting an impasse or being stuck or whatever it might be, what that is often suggesting is that you might be on the right track because first, you're invested enough to become confused in the first place. But second, what's one of the most rewarding things we can experience as an educator? When our students have an aha moment. Well, you can't have an aha moment unless you go through a period of being stuck or struggling or confused before you get there. The two of them are sort of two sides of the same coin. So instead of saying, give the students the answer. What we should be saying is, let's help the students to understand that this is an important part of the process, and let's work through together to develop strategies so that they can work through it. So that's something that I try and instill with my students. Look, we're going to do some really heavy learning theory here. Your previous degrees were in completely different areas. This is all going to be new to you. You're going to find it hard and complicated, and that's okay. That's part of the process.
Yep.
From there, I think you can then have a better conversation about how you might move forward with that. And it's not this kind of signal, oh my God, this is really hard. I'm feeling really stuck here. I can't do this. It's like, I'm really stuck here. I'm feeling confused. I can do this. And here are some strategies that I've got to work through it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've been working with students on the in their writing, and one of my favorite things, my professor Frank Gates, who is a decision scientist, once said, is writing is nature's way of telling you how unclear your thinking is. And that's one of the things that I fear with AI supported writing, and I use the word supported loosely here, is that people aren't going to get the productive struggle of trying to understand something so we can articulate it. Are you starting
Absolutely.
to see that as well?
Yeah. So, with a couple of colleagues, Dragan Gasovic from Monash University in particular, we've been talking about this idea of the performance paradox. So, AI will help you get to the finish line, but it's not going to give you the kind of work related positive impact that you would have by going through that process yourself. So it's almost as though the two things have been decoupled. You can have the performance without necessarily going through the process. It's kind of like instead of running the marathon, you do it on an e-scooter, right? Sure, you'll get to
Yeah,
the finish line, but you're not actually going to get any fitter by doing that. And the
right.
point that we now kind of need to focus on is the getting fit part. Of course, this is all a really difficult problem because unlike something like running a marathon where there's a very clear, you run it under 3 hours, you're a pretty good marathon runner. We're trying to make these distal inferences about where our students are on the basis of this kind of snapshot that often happens at the end of some process, and the process has become completely opaque. So it's no wonder that there are opportunities in there to then bypass that process because we can't measure any of this stuff directly. I mean, David, we've got similar backgrounds. The mind is
Hmm.
not something you can measure. You can only ever infer what might be going on
Yes.
there. And we're trying to infer, there are lots and lots of arguments out there about what learning actually is, vehement arguments that have been going on for 100 years. But I think one thing that we can probably all agree on is that there is some sort of change that happens through learning, yet we're trying to measure it at a distance at a point in time. So there's a misalignment between what we're understanding as what assessment should be and what learning is fundamentally. So, and I think that, education systems have now been caught with their pants down because we've now got these systems that allow students to be able to just get to the finish line by whatever means necessary as fast as possible. Of course, that was around before with things like contract cheating, but contract cheaters weren't sitting in your computer by bringing up a website page and typing in something into a chatbot. Like it's become the barriers to entry have almost disappeared to be able to do this. So that's where I think this misalignment is something that we've got to take a little bit more seriously. If we're accepting the premise that learning is a change process, then maybe we need to take that more seriously and think about how we might assess that. And I'm not saying there's a simple solution to that. To me, I think that part of the discussion we have to have is what role teachers play in that. So, as I said before, class of 250, class of 25, I'm much less concerned about the issues that I'm seeing or might see in the small group because I know my students, right? I've got a lot of experience. I sit beside them for 3 hours a week and I work with them. I see their learning happening in real time. I'm seeing that change happen. What does that mean in terms of a valid assessment task? That's a bit more tricky, right? Because am I biased because I've sat next to them all semester? Am I going to assess them fairly? There's lots of things that I think we need to kind of think about there. But if we want to get serious about learning as a change process and assessing that in a way that is valid, a single snapshot in time that is some distal inference about what's happening in a student's mind is probably not going to cut it. We need some other ways of doing that.
And I'll even go further in saying that the simple scaffolded revision assignment, which has been my go-to for a long time, even that is too much of a snapshot to be able to be effective. It's funny that
Yep.
you use the word decoupled because I use that in talks all the time. This is the first time in human history where a written or oral or other kind of generated output is decoupled from understanding the material at a fundamental level. It's You don't have to understand what you're saying. A few key buzzwords and phrases entered into the right chatbot will get you a pretty reasonable, at least on the surface, coherent response to any kind of query you might have. So understanding and producing material are decoupled. So therefore, those products of learning, if that things that used to be products of learning are no longer necessarily that. And so, like you're saying, we're going to have to think seriously about how are we going to get our pants back up, to use your metaphor. It's going to have to be process. It's going to have to be an ongoing period of time. And when we have those snapshots, as people like Kane Murdoch and Phil Dawson point out, we're going to have to lock these things down because,
Yeah.
and even that's less preferable to me than process. But I understand that in those 250 person classes, we're in a different ball game.
Yeah, I mean, and we've got to have a mix of strategies here, right? I don't think there's a silver bullet that's going to fix all of this. And that's part of the nuance of what this means in individual contexts. You know, every context, every discipline is going to look different. This is going to play out in different ways. And I think what we probably need to consider, and you know, this is some of the work that I do thinking about how this impacts colleagues across the full spectrum of disciplines in higher ed and increasingly in K to 12, is that we need to be able to provide educators with a toolbox of approaches that they might be able to choose from and trust them as professionals to make the best decision about which of those tools in the toolbox is most appropriate for their context. You know, the idea that we're going to
Mhm.
fix all of this by putting a pen and paper exam into every unit, that, you know, that's not going to work, right?
I laugh when people say, "Oh yeah, we're going to go back to blue book exams." I assume you have something similar. I said, "Yeah, I went to school when there were blue book exams, and I can assure you there was cheating when I went to school." So, I mean, I think it's false nostalgia.
Yeah. And look, it just doesn't. So, like I said, a lot of my students are educators. The group that I had last year are going to walk into a classroom in 2 weeks' time. The fact that they could reproduce something on an exam sheet in a, you know, pen and paper in an exam hall is not going to actually tell me whether or not they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities that I need them to have in 2 weeks' time when they walk into those classrooms. I need other tools in the toolbox to be able to know for certain that those students can do that work. But that's my context, right? If I'm in first year biology or something like that, great. You know what? A pen and paper exam is probably going to be appropriate for some of the sorts of things that knowledge is still important. Um,
Yes.
Toolbox, yeah.
Yeah. And your point about the time frame is so critical. Oftentimes, I think the multiple choice assessment is a perfect example of how not to test knowledge. Who really cares in the US context? Who really cares how much you know in February? I need to know what you know 6 months, a year down the line. And that realization as a learning cognitive scientist is what completely changed my education practice. The realization that most students don't remember 90% of what you teach them if you teach them in that sort of knowledge oriented way. So that changed me to from a breadth first, depth never, to mostly depth with just a little bit of breadth to get them interested in some material. And I said to myself, all right, in a year or 2 years or 5 years, are gonna take from my class? And the answer is the thing that they owned, whatever that might be. And then we just have to figure out for those different contexts, what does ownership look like?
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of makes me think about my own experience as an undergrad. I didn't cheat because I wasn't brought up that way, but I would say that my learning didn't have integrity. And a lot of that was because I was often assessed using multiple choice exams, high stakes at the end of a semester, and the way in which those exams were set up is that a lot of it was based on the fact that you understood a bunch of definitions of key terms, right? So I figured out, well, if that's what you're going to assess me on, what's the fastest way for me to get there? Well, I'm going to memorize a glossary of the textbook, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, sure, that worked, got me a good mark on the exam. 3 days later, it was all gone, right? So did I cheat? Well, technically, no. But my learning, I don't think, had a lot of integrity. Going to the way that you've described it in the book, I don't think my learning had much integrity at all because I didn't really learn anything that persisted. Right? I got through, I managed to perform, but the learning didn't have, it wasn't where it needed to be. And I think now we're seeing that almost weaponized to a point. AI is allowing that, as we've talked about, decoupling to happen so that there's almost no relationship between those two things if that's the way that the situation is kind of pushing students towards.
You might have thought that the remote assessments during COVID would have taught us our lesson, but I think it's very clear that it didn't. But now, like you said, if we don't learn this lesson, we risk irrelevance. Um,
Absolutely.
this conversation's brought me to thank someone out there who I don't know will ever hear this, but Professor Bob Pacella taught me sensation and perception as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and I did not think much of this class at all. He had us write three papers on any topic we wanted. I wrote a paper, and I'll tell you this is now 30 years since, on why no one can ever see the Grand Canyon ever again, because it was about context and perception. I owned that material, and as a result, it's still with me. I
Yeah.
still struggle to remember some of the parts of the limbic system from a course that same semester in biopsych, which was a great course in and of itself, but I didn't own that material.
Yeah. That's something, isn't it? But it
It
does speak
is.
to it does speak to a problem that I think we have in higher ed. It's particularly acute here in Australia, but I know other parts of the world are similar. The job of an educator is becoming more complicated. And for many of our colleagues, they don't necessarily have the level of preparation that I think is required to do that job now. For a lot of people, I mean, my own introduction was I was given a textbook, I was told what time the class was on, and then sent on my way. No other induction, no degree, no workshops, no nothing. It's sort of like a 2 minute conversation, go and sign a contract, and you're off. And I don't think we can get away with that anymore. I think the level of preparation that is required to be a good educator in this day and age, particularly if you think about something like assessment design, was it was already extraordinarily complicated and has become even more so. I think we need to have a conversation about what kind of standards we're prepared to accept for educators in higher education. In Australia, it is the only sector of formal education where you are not required to have a qualification to teach into it. Right, everywhere else you are required to be qualified. Yet higher education is supposed to be the pinnacle, and it's not required. It seems kind of paradoxical, particularly given how complicated this is all becoming.
Absolutely. I had a thought. What do you think of the possibility of we have instructional designers? That's now a career, and it's a very thank goodness for them. What if there were a similar parallel track for assessment designers, not just online, but in general? And so we have content experts, we have instructional designers who build the coursework, and then we have assessment designers who work with them. Their order would probably be reversed, so that we had people who actually were solely experts at thinking about how to build the kinds of assessments that we're talking about being so difficult to build.
Look, I think that there are people who, by proxy, have kind of ended up in that role given the situation that we find ourselves in now. I've got many wonderful colleagues who are doing an amazing job with supporting assessment design changes at my institution, and I'm seeing that in other parts of Australia and the world. That is one way I think that we can start to deal with this problem is to kind of almost pull apart the various different aspects of what it takes to run a large kind of cohort of students through a program. The other, of course, and the more tricky one and the less palatable one is maybe we shouldn't be doing all of this at scale. There is a very good reason why my group of 25 students is much easier to manage and I have less concerns about academic integrity with them than the 250, right? The sheer
We're not
scale,
widget builders. Yeah.
that's right. The sheer scale of what we do, maybe that's not appropriate anymore. Maybe we need to think about a different model of what that might look like. Of course, the people who are in charge of institutional finances at this point are starting to lose the blood flow from their faces. Um, but I think we do have to ask some questions about what the model of higher education needs to look like into the future, and perhaps doing these things 1,000 students at a time or more is not appropriate. There is something really important about an embodied, embedded human being at this point in time existing in an environment with other humans that is really critical to learning and to teaching. Maybe we should be emphasizing that a bit more. So I think there's a number of different ways that this could potentially play out, but we've got to start to ask some of these questions. The sorts of discussions that I'm seeing happening in K to 12. So I mostly focus on senior secondary in some of the other work that I do. It's a very different conversation when you have smaller groups of students, a lot of contact time, and trained educators, right? All of a sudden, we have a very different dynamic playing out in a very different way. Are students using AI to shortcut the learning process? Yeah, of course they are. That's still happening there. But is there a different way of being able to manage that? Yes, because you've got trained educators who are spending a lot of time with small groups of students. They know the students a lot better. They're able to see some of the issues emerging earlier on. Maybe we need to ask the question whether or not we've got the right model.
And we work back to that gets us back to process, both in terms of learning and assessment. The, this scares me to no end that what we're going to have is rich people who are taught in the model you're describing and everyone else taught in the widget factory. Actually, you could argue that's what we have now in the US. But it could become, we could be taking humans out of university teaching and left, we call them colleges, but they're still 4-year bachelor's institutions. Um, that's really concerning.
Agreed. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, this is not in terms of the structure. There are parts of this that are not necessarily new. You know, we go back to thinking about the universities for the elite, the Oxford tutorial model, whether it was a 6-to-1 ratio, or
Yes.
less. Um, yeah, I agree. I think that that's a terrifying prospect, and it could very well be that human teachers are only for rich people at some point, and that's unacceptable. I can't personally accept an environment where that starts to happen. I mean, haven't we learned our lessons that that's probably not the way to go here? Um,
Yep.
yeah, and particularly because I've got young children, I'm really concerned that we end up in a world where the bulk of teaching is left to bots when all of the evidence that I've seen, and look, maybe this will change in the future as we get more humanoid type robots that have got this AI embedded in it. Look, I don't know what the future is going to be, but humans learn better from and with other humans.
Yep.
You know, so
But they're great tools, right? I mean, it would be really nice to have a human-driven AI set of tools, right? I don't, if a student could ask the bot a question about the syllabus instead of me, I would like that. That would be great. I think the student would like that too. In the same reason that people don't want to pick up the phone, they're going to be more than happy to ask an AI something they might be unwilling to ask me, and that's a reasonable place. It's just the reductio ad absurdum to the point where there's no person at the other end of the phone it just is not a good situation for us to be in.
no. But I can sort of understand it from a policymaker's point of view. If you look around the world, in many parts of the world, including here, we have dramatic teacher shortages because teaching is hard. Like it was a hard job already.
Hmm.
There are all sorts of additional pressures being put on teachers from parents, from the systems that they're within. It's not a particularly attractive job. So, from a policymaker's perspective, I have an issue over here in that I've got voters screaming at me because their kids aren't getting a good enough education experience because there's not enough teachers. Here's a machine that might actually start to do something about that problem. Why don't we just take this and put this over here, and that will fix all of the issues that we've got? But I think part of that, and your comments, I think, speak to this as well, David, is that the point of this is not to replace teachers; it should be to augment them.
Hmm.
What is going to help the teachers to do the more human things that are important for learning and spend less time dealing with all of the other crap? But that's a really complex set of issues. And although I think that there's some potential there, I still think we've got a long way to go before we know how to embed this new technology in such a way that that's actually going to happen. There's all these trite arguments about, oh, yeah, AI is going to fix all of the administrative workload for teachers. Well, there's not a lot of evidence of that so far because what it's done in a lot of instances is just create more work that is kind of different to what was being done before and is not necessarily doing the best job of facilitating the learning for the students. So, yes, I agree. I think there's some potential if we shift to this idea of augmenting teachers rather than replacing them. But my sense is we've got a long way to go to figure out how to do that well. There's some clues and there's some early potential, but there's a long, long way to go.
And the unintended consequence of that gets back to your point from earlier, which is we want to be leaning into the humanity of education. AI is going to be able to do a lot of things without humans in the loop. It already can, and it's going to continue to do more of those things. And this is okay. This is fine. There are certain things AI should be doing. Going down into mines would be a great example, right? Let's get humans out of that loop if we can, right? Let's save some lives. But there's a lot of things I don't want AI doing, and AI should not be doing. And therefore, we have to be able to lean into the human parts of education so that we can continue to make reasonable decisions about what humans can do and what they can't. You've mentioned embodiment a couple times, and it's exactly where I would go. Until machines have the ability to feel pain and have literal skin in the game, they should not be able to make ethical decisions. They don't understand that the decisions they're making are about symbols of something that exists in the world. They just are symbol manipulators. That's this fundamental difference between living and non-living minds, I think, is intentionality. And so until that changes, we should not allow machines to make meaningful decisions.
Yeah, agreed. Where I reckon this starts to get really messy is the not too distant future where that area, I mean, it's already becoming grey. It's going to become increasingly grey. You know, at one level, humans ourselves are digital. You know, neuron fires or doesn't fire. It's a one or a zero. So are we? And this is something that I grapple with all the time because I agree. I don't buy this argument that AI is conscious or any of this stuff. But at some point, the thing is going to become so complex and sophisticated that it's going to be really, really hard to tell. You know, and at that point, yes, there'll be an uncanny valley type situation where it'll all feel a bit creepy, but then we're going to start to blur those boundaries increasingly over time. And then what does that mean? And what does that mean for what it means to be a human and all of the things that we value, as you've alluded to, David? I don't know. And that's a really uncertain future that I feel quite uncomfortable about. But perhaps that's kind of the key in all of this is that we accept that that level of uncertainty is something that is a constant now. You know, perhaps the only constant is that there is no constant, right?
It's
So,
always been true. It's just more obvious.
exactly. So maybe we should be focusing on the things that are going to allow our students and ourselves to be adaptive to whatever that future might look like. I always wanted to study philosophy. I didn't because there were no jobs at the end of it. Ended up doing psychology instead. But I think that there are some really fundamental philosophical questions that I think are going to continue to emerge as this change plays out over time. And then feeding back to where our conversation started, what does this mean for the integrity, not just of assessment? What does this mean for the integrity of learning? What does this mean for the integrity of learning in the age of AI when we don't necessarily know for certain what are the things that we need to focus on? What do our students need to know? What skills do they need to have? What does their future look like? There's so much uncertainty around all of these things. You know, how do we keep that whole and keep it focused on the things that we value and the things that we want out of a higher education? And maybe that's the key. We just need to keep asking that question. You know, are we doing the things that matter here or not?
Yeah. And are we doing the things that are best for both the individuals in front of us and the ones who are not in front of us? Because it's easy to forget about the ones who aren't the squeaky wheels, who are the students of our students or whoever down the road.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We could do this all day. I think it's fairly clear. Uh, but why don't we wrap up with maybe a little bit of advice? Because you've had such an incredible role in the sort of the changes that are hopefully starting to happen in Australia. From where you sit, what's one thing if you had the time and resources that you would start to do that or that you would recommend someone do as they're beginning to make the kinds of changes that we're talking about for us as instructors or instructional designers at that level of change?
Something that I think about a lot is when do I feel really confident as an educator that I've got a lot of insight into a student's learning. Now, for better or worse, I do come back to the research students that I work with, right? I spend extended periods of time, I see them week after week. And you know what? At the end of a PhD or at the end of an honors project, I'm very confident that I can stand up hand on heart and say, you know what? I know that student, I know they're learning, I've seen their progress, and I've seen the change occur over time. How can we bridge that gap when we've got 25, 250 students? I think that's the question that I have constantly got in my mind. And maybe that's something that I think that there is some level of hope in all of this. How can we understand our students better to understand their learning better? And I think that there's two components to this. There's been a lot of emphasis over the last decade about being student centered, which I think is right and I think is fair. And I think we want to have students involved in decision making. We want them to be partners in the process of education. And I think that there's a lot of value in that work. But we also have to do that in parallel to thinking about their learning. So, students and their learning. And I think the more we can do to bridge the gap between ourselves as educators and our students, however many of them we are working with, the better placed I think we are to be able to understand them and understand the learning process that they're going through. I think going back to what we've just talked about, AI will play a role in helping to bridge that gap, but we've got some more work to do to figure out how we might do that well. In the meantime, to me, I'm always trying to remind myself, how can I help how can I understand my students better in order to understand their learning better? And I use that as the kind of lens through which I'm trying to make changes in what I do as an educator to try and do that. It's not easy, particularly with
No.
250 or I know many of our colleagues have got 1,000 or more students. But that I think is the challenge here. How do we know our students so we can know their learning?
I love it. What a great place to end the conversation, at least for now, because I think we'll be doing this again. Jason, thank you so much for your time and insight. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, David. It was great to chat with you.
Today, we're talking with Professor Jason Lodge about all things relating to AI and learning, and maybe a little academic integrity, but maybe not as much as some of you are hoping for. So tune in for another time where we'll do this again. Thanks again.